Hello. Let me say hello to everyone who is watching us now or who will be watching us later. My name is Victor Kipiani. It's a special pleasure for me to meet you all online. This time we will be discussing the recent conflict in Gaza, but most importantly, we will be discussing the policy which Israel took during the conflict, and also, not less important, Israel in the aftermath of the conflicts. As we all know, Israel has a new government, interesting enough in many respects, and we Georgians, who proud ourselves being as a good friends and special partner for Israel, and likewise Israel, which is doing great job in supporting our sovereignty and national interests. It's always a very insightful opportunity to get more knowledge what's happening in Israel, what are the domestic policies, and what are the foreign policies, and with whom not to discuss those issues, if not with His Excellency, Ambassador of Israel to Georgia, Mr. Ran Gidor. May I welcome you, Your Excellency, and may I express my special gratitude.
Thank you.
Joining us at this webinar. We're also joined by my colleague at GeoKeys, Dr. Emil Avdaliani, who is the head of the Middle East Studies. So I very much hope that within the next hour we'll have good discussions, good insights into the matters on the ground. We'll have probably a few questions from my side, and I very much hope that some questions would also arrive from the audience. But well, yeah, here we are. We're ready to start. We're ready to go into discussions. And as I've said, Israel at this point in time has a new government, which consists of a quite diverse and, as some people say, fragile coalition. That coalition, I dislike the word fragile. It's diverse, but still quite multiple in many respects. It provides for variety of political groups and political parties of different tastes and different ideologies. It has a very interesting prime minister, and also not less interesting foreign minister who will become a prime minister in 2 years' time. We also are witnessing very interesting developments in the region, and actually when I mentioned the Gaza conflict, this conflict was also unique in terms that it has presented the first test for the Abraham Accords. And I saw from my side different stance which number of Arab countries took during the conflict. And this is also something which I would I would definitely ask His Excellency to share his views and opinions. We'll also probably have to touch on possibly structuring relationships between the new governments and the current US administration. And we'll explain later on why this specificity in those relationships and from due to what reasons that specificity could arise. So all in all, probably a few other issues which relates to the regional dialogue, ownership of the process, again, possible disengagement of the United States from the region, as some scholars or some politicians say, could be expected within the next years. But I would stop here, still keeping those questions in a more fully fledged shape at some later point, and will give a floor to His Excellency. Again, Ambassador, thank you so much indeed. I should say, like I've said before, we started the webinar that I'm very much indebted for all the great job you are doing in this country and for the benefit of our good partnership. And I'm also my special and my partisan thanks to you for standing next to GeoKeys and always reaching out to us, and always considering to participate in various events. We recently had a extremely insightful lecture of His Excellency with GeoKey students, and that was a big delight. So please, Ambassador, we are all on attention, and thank you so much again.
Thank you. Thank you, Victor. It's a pleasure to be here again and address your colleagues and friends. When coming to discuss not just the recent war between Israel and Hamas terrorist organization, but any war, we have to ask ourselves, with the benefit of hindsight, what were the adversaries, the parties hoping to achieve? Now, when you look at the balance of power, I mean, Hamas could never, even in the best case scenario, hope to win any kind of military engagement against Israel. It's not a secret that Israel is a regional power, superpower, some would say. It has one of the world's top 10 armies with strategic capabilities and a very significant arsenal of cutting-edge technology. And Hamas, on the other hand, despite being supplied, trained, and financed by Iran, is a paramilitary force. Yes, compared to other terrorist organizations, it has relatively sophisticated capabilities, including those of industrial line manufacturing of rockets and Katyushas and some missiles. But I mean, there's no doubt that Hamas could never, in a million years, hope to win any kind of military engagement against Israel. So if one accepts this paradigm, then one has to continue by asking oneself, so what was Hamas hoping to achieve by provoking Israel? And this is actually the crux of the matter. Now, even those international commentators and analysts and pundits who criticize Israel for all sorts of reasons, this time accepted the empirical fact that the war started as a result of unprovoked shelling of Israel by Hamas. It didn't start by, as in some of the previous engagements, by Israel taking out some terrorist mastermind. No, what happened was that exactly on the 10th of May, during the Ramadan, the holy Ramadan month in Jerusalem, Hamas issued an ultimatum at 16 hours, same time as now, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 10th of May, Hamas said to the Israeli government, we're giving you an ultimatum, unless you withdraw Israeli police from the central part of Jerusalem, Temple Mount, and from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem, we're going to attack. And 2 hours later, 18:02, they delivered. Hamas started shelling Israeli community centers, civilian population centers with rockets and missiles. So Hamas started the war. Even Hamas accepts it. So what were they hoping to achieve? And this is the crux of the matter. Here lies the rationale that dictates the behavior of both parties. So what was Hamas hoping to achieve? Well, there are several explanations for that, but the main one is the fact that Hamas wanted to demonstrate to the Palestinian people, their own constituency, who's boss, who calls the shots, who's the master of the house. Now, as we all know, Palestine has been divided between two entities since 2007 for almost 15 years. There's the West Bank, which is under the authority of the Palestinian Authority, led by President Abbas, Abu Mazen. And there's the Gaza Strip, which has been under the effective control of the Hamas terrorist organization since the coup d'etat in 2007. Those two entities are rivals and sometimes enemies. Now, what happened was that since the coup d'etat in 2007, there has been no parliamentary election on the Palestinian side. The last parliamentary election on the Palestinian side had taken place in 2006, exactly 15 years ago. And of course, as one would expect, that put an enormous question mark over the legitimacy of the power organs, the leadership, the senior leadership, who for 15 years haven't had to go back to the electorate and ask for an expression of confidence. So President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority announced that the elections will take place on the 22nd of May. However, successive opinion polls had proven to him that Hamas was going to win the election, that Fatah or the PLO were going to be defeated. Therefore, Hamas was going to take over the West Bank in addition to the Gaza Strip. And lo and behold, President Abbas suddenly announced that the cancellation of the Palestinian election. That coincided with a few other factors. First of all, the month of Ramadan. The month of May is already extremely hot in the Middle East. And you talk about tens of thousands of Palestinian youth who don't go to school or to work. They fast during the day. They sit about, and the temperature, not just weather-wise, but the political temperature inevitably rises every year during the month of Ramadan. They sit around, they are susceptible to any kind of incitement, and all that's missing is the spark in order to cause a major explosion. And then the third factor was the legal bureaucratic conflict over the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. Now, here I have to open brackets and explain for 1 minute what we're talking about because it's been on the news. As you know, as everyone knows, Jews have been living in the Holy Land for 3,000 years. Even during 2,000 years of diaspora, when the Jews had been kicked out of the Holy Land by the Roman Empire, the Jews still remained in 4 cities in the Holy Land, specifically Jerusalem. Jews had never left Jerusalem. And Jews bought land and property in this neighborhood, which nowadays is called Sheikh Jarrah. In 1948, during our War of Independence, the Jordanian army captured East Jerusalem and the holy city of Jerusalem, everything, the square mile within the Jerusalem walls. And Jews were deported. Only 19 years later, in 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israel recaptured Jerusalem in its entirety. Now, during those 19 years when Jews were absent from East Jerusalem and their old town, the Jordanians invited Palestinian families to settle down in those houses vacated by the Jews. And they have been there ever since. Now, 54 years later, some of those descendants of the Jewish families are trying to reclaim their property, and they're proving, I mean, Victor, you're a lawyer, we're talking to many other lawyers here, they build, bills of ownership, deeds of ownership, proving that they are the rightful owners of that property. However, this is a tragic humanitarian case because the Palestinian families that have been living there for 54 years can't just get up and leave and go where. So we're talking about hundreds of people who are locked into this legal bureaucratic conflict, and both sides are equally right and equally wrong. The Jewish families are the rightful owners. The Palestinians, however, have been the de facto occupants of those houses for over half a century. So this is why the legal dispute has been dragging its feet through the courts for over 15 years and went all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, that provided the spark, the pretext, the excuse that Hamas had been looking for. They wanted, as I said right from the beginning, to demonstrate to the Palestinian people, to their own constituency, who is the legitimate boss, the master who calls the shots within Palestine, specifically since President Abbas had cancelled unilaterally the pre-scheduled election. And now they found their excuse. They said, because of this legal dispute in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, we're giving the Israeli government an ultimatum, a 2-hour ultimatum, to clear Israeli police and all security organs out of that place. And 2 hours later, they attacked. Well, the statistics are quite revealing. The war went on for 11 days, between the 10th and the 21st of May. During that time, during the first 24 hours, only the first 24 hours, Hamas had launched over 200 rockets at Jerusalem and the Israeli civilian population centers along our southern border. All in all, throughout the war, Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, which is another Palestinian terror organization based in Gaza, they launched over 4,360 rockets into Israel. 4,360 rockets. This is like a shower of rockets, a rain of rockets. Luckily, as some of you will know, Israel had developed already years ago the world's first and arguably best missile defense system, which is called Iron Dome. Iron Dome has a very sophisticated radar that analyzes within split of seconds the trajectory of the incoming missile and determines whether that missile is heading towards a civilian settlement or open space. If it's open space, then the system doesn't react. But if the computer determines that it's headed towards a neighborhood or some kind of civilian settlement, then the system automatically launches an intercepting rocket to intercept and shoot down the incoming missile. So out of 4,360 incoming rockets, Iron Dome shot down 1,661. It's about a third. But it's about a third of the rockets that have been launched, but it makes for 90% of the rockets that were headed towards civilian population centers. So as a result of this technology, all in all, only 9 people were killed. I say only, of course, this is very tragic. 9 people were killed on the Israeli side, 6 Israelis and 3 foreigners. And but we suffered some injuries. 1,843 rockets fell in open areas and fields, and 680 Palestinian rockets landed inside the Gaza Strip because they have a primitive mechanism, so they were not sophisticated enough to be accurately hitting their destination. So they landed inside the Gaza Strip, killing at least 20 people. In other words, Hamas killed Palestinian people with their own rockets. Of course, the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, and the Israeli Air Force attacked massively terror infrastructure in Gaza. Over 6,500 sorties, and we destroyed over 100 kilometers of underground military tunnels, what Hamas referred to as the Palestinian Metro. Can you imagine the kind of budget that's needed in order to dig up 100 kilometers of underground tunnels? And we're not just talking about a primitive tunnel. They are fortified with cement. They have infrastructure, electricity, sometimes air conditioning. Those tunnels were used in order to store ammunition bunkers, missiles, in order to smuggle people and military hardware from the Sinai Peninsula under Egyptian control into Israel. So the Israeli Air Force destroyed 100 kilometers. And as far as we know, we managed to take out at least 225 terrorists. So where are we now? I'm afraid nobody knows, because of course, as was predictable, Israel wants hands down the military engagement. And after 11 days, both sides agreed to a ceasefire with no preconditions and no clear agreement. I mean, there's no text about the ceasefire. This is the 4th time that we've been fighting with Hamas since 2009. So on average, every 2-3 years, there's a military showdown that always ends up more or less inconclusively. We kill hundreds of terrorists, we destroy their infrastructure, And then 2, 3 years later, thanks to largely to Iranian support, they managed to resurrect some of their military capability. It's worth highlighting, and here I will end, I don't want to take up too much time. It's worth highlighting once again, because I've seen some news items, even in the Georgian media. This was not a war between Israelis and Palestinians. We have no problem with the Palestinians, and we haven't fought a war with Palestinians in the West Bank for almost 2 decades. This was a war between Israel and an organization that is listed in the terror list of the United States, Australia, Canada, Japan, and most EU member states. And if you look up the manifesto of Hamas, which is easily available on the web, you will find that they don't talk about national determination or statehood for Palestine. It's a classic anti-Semitic manifesto which calls upon the Muslims all over the world to kill the infidel. In other words, we Jews are infidels. It's almost medieval. We are the infidels, and Jews have to be destroyed, killed, and murdered wherever they can be found. So this is the organization that we're dealing with, and this is why, unfortunately, the prospects for any kind of compromise or peace negotiations between us and Hamas are completely unrealistic at this stage. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much indeed, Ambassador. And by the way, please educate me probably, and I should excuse my the lack of knowledge. Where Hezbollah and Fatah are standing in all this game? Because as I know, based on my knowledge, at some point both Hezbollah and Hamas were heavily backed up by Iran. But I could be wrong. But where Hezbollah has gone and where Fatah is in this game?
You're absolutely right, Victor. Hezbollah is the #1 military proxy of Iran in the Middle East. Now, I started off by describing Hamas as a rather pathetic paramilitary terrorist force that can inflict some injuries or damage inside Israel, but it's nowhere near being able to pose a serious threat to Israel. Hezbollah is a totally different story. Hezbollah is modern army, fully equipped by Iran. Hezbollah has almost 200,000 rockets and missiles covering the entire range of the state of Israel. Plus, for the past few years, Iran has been supporting Hezbollah in developing highly accurate mechanisms for their warheads. So in the case of future military showdown between Israel and Hezbollah, and the last one took place in 2007, we're talking about a major all-out conventional war with thousands of civilian casualties on both sides, which is probably why Hezbollah didn't take sides this time around, because it's not something you decide on lightheartedly. Moreover, as we all know, Hezbollah is at least pretending to be a legitimate force within Lebanon. It even has a so-called political wing inside the Lebanese parliament. And Lebanon is virtually defunct. It's gone bankrupt. Lebanon is a failed state right now. And as was evidenced by the enormous tragic explosion that took place in the Beirut harbor a few months ago, which devastated huge parts of Beirut. So the country has gone bankrupt. People are starving. The currency, national currency, has lost 90% of its value vis-a-vis the US dollar. So Hezbollah presumably didn't want to compound the suffering of the population by starting a completely unnecessary war with Israel, just in order to come to the defense or to show solidarity with Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. That's presumably why.
I see. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. And with your permission, may I go to Emil Abdaliani? So, Emil, thank you so much for joining us. And please, what is your take? What is your take? What would you single out as the most special for the recent conflict? What are your predictions in terms of fallouts? Ambassador has said that no one knows. I mean, at least what would happen. from now on, but based on your knowledge and your insight. So please give us your views on the issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor, for your introduction thoughts and your speech. Also, thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your speech. I would like to divide my short speech in two parts. First will be more devoted to the new level of cooperation, I would say, between Hamas and Iran, and the second part will be on what this recent latest escalation of conflict, I would say, shows us, tells us about the changing global order, world order, which is in not in chaos as many argue, but still is changing. And there are some interesting indications on how Eurasian powers try to use this recent escalation for their benefit. First, of course, is how different was this latest escalation from what we had before. First of all, is the increased cooperation between Iran and Hamas, and this was seen in many on many levels. And the first among them is, of course, the use of drones by Hamas, which until then was not basically recorded by military analysts. And if we classify those drones, it's very easy to link them to the production in Iran. There are also numerous instances of the use of those drones by those proxy powers which are linked to Iran elsewhere, let's say in Yemen or in other parts of the Middle East. So on a I would say qualitative level, this is a much different thing from what we witnessed from before. And of course, if you look to what Iranian media was saying during the escalation and after the escalation itself, you see how Hamas and Iran were closely cooperating with each other on not only tactical, but also on a nearly strategic level, and how the sharing of highly sensitive information to float back and forth between Iran and Hamas. And this all what we've got from the open media resources. The rationale behind these revelations, of course, is unknown, but Iranian media surely wanted to show that qualitatively the level of cooperation between Tehran and Hamas is very different from what we had before. Of course, this all fits into the Iranian grand strategy, if we might call it, in the Middle East, where it tries to link to various organizations and states which try to position themselves against Israel, against the US, and generally still holding liberal world order. And in that sense, Iran is trying to do what Iranian leaders from the past, whether it's Achaemenid period or Sasanian period or even Safavid period, dynasties of the Iranian state, when they try to dominate Mesopotamia, Syria, and link to and try to link to the Mediterranean. And if you compare this thinking of Iran from the past with what we've got nowadays, you see those similarities between the past and the present, and how the modern Iranian state explicitly tries to have a land corridor from Iran to Mediterranean through Iraq, Syria, to Lebanon, and to have a direct connection to with Hamas and other organizations. So this I would say escalation between Israel and Hamas generally fits into the Iranian grand strategy in the Middle East. On the other hand, we've got the changing global order, and I would like to point out some interesting statements by world leaders, for example, Turkish president, Russian president, Chinese leadership, how their thinking was, I wouldn't say very different from what they were saying in the recent past, but how the changing global order, I mean, relative decline of the Western authority or crisis of authority in the Western leadership generally over the past several years impacts their thinking, I mean Russian, Turkish, and Chinese thinking, and how they try to use the various conflicts to their benefit. And actually, this escalation in their statements, I mean, made by Beijing, Ankara, and Russia, shows that they try to sideline the Western influence from those conflicts which are near to their borders, in the regions which are crucial for Moscow, Ankara, and Beijing. And this actually fits into the overall development, or I would say similar developments, which we have in Central Asia, where China and Russia sort of try to build an order of exclusion, I would say, for outside powers, or what we've got in South Caucasus, where Russia, Turkey, and not so much Iran, but we could include Iran too, tried to build an order where the EU and the United States are not that much present in the decision-making, peace-building measures, or even in economic infrastructure projects. So this, what Chinese, Russian, and Turkish leadership were saying about the escalation between Hamas and Israel, I would again reiterate, fits into the overall narrative of how, in their view, ineffective is the Western leadership in dealing with long-lasting conflicts, and how their view of a new world order will be more beneficial for Eurasian conflicts. And in their understanding, perhaps even a peacekeeper mission should be placed in the territory to just to hold peace between Israelis and Palestinians. So this simply shows how Eurasian powers try to use various conflicts where Western leadership cannot really provide concrete measures to solve them, and where again Eurasian powers sort of try to build a new understanding on long-term conflicts and their vision to solve them. Of course, it's not clear how I would say how successful they would be, but even if we take an example of Afghanistan and the US leadership's decision to withdraw from this country by September, this again shows how China, Russia, perhaps Pakistan, and other neighboring countries would try to fill in the gap and sort of provide a new version of peace building strategy in Afghanistan. And I would say that one of the components of the new peace building initiatives could be that Russia and China, at least rhetorically, they claim that they will not be as pushy as I would say as pushy as the West in terms of imposing sort of the Western ideas of peace building. So their approach, I mean, Eurasian approach will be very different from the Western approach. And they might succeed in some places. Again, in Afghanistan, they could succeed. But in terms of confrontation between Israel and Hamas, it will be much more difficult. First of all, it will be difficult because of the still huge U.S. interest in the region and huge support of Washington for Israel. So here, I would say that perhaps Russian Chinese statements were more rhetorical, but they nevertheless they indicate their growing thinking, their evolving thinking, I would say, about the changing world order. So I would say that these are basically two major points which I wanted to make, and I would be happy to answer your questions. So just engage into discussion.
Well, thank you so much indeed. And the question to you at this point, you made a striking comparison, and I never thought before about that similarity between two regions, which is the Middle East and the South Caucasus. More specifically, you mentioned that what brings those regions closer to each other in many respects. In one critical respect is that an attempt to squeeze out the Western interests and to squeeze out the Western influence, the Western presence. And you made a very good point, because actually that's what we're seemingly witnessing in the South Caucasus, at least, based on what we have under our possession in terms of knowledge, in terms of information, that actually what unites those powers which never accomplished a unity historically, but at this point of time, it brings them on the same page. So since we're always trying to identify new venues of comparing Middle East and South Caucasus, could you also think of any semblances on top of what you said? Excuse me for this probably very complex question, but complex questions are always asked when you talk with well-known academician, and you are the one. So, but sorry for putting on the spot. But can you think of something else on top of that similarity of someone's squeezing the West out of the region?
Thank you, Victor, for your question. Yes, I would say that first, just generally saying that similarities are indeed there. I mean, between South Caucasus and larger Middle East, and I would call this process perhaps regionalization of geopolitics here in various spots in Eurasia, which by which I mean several regional powers sort of trying to solve those problems which they have in their neighborhood by explicitly excluding third powers. These third powers could be Europeans, could be Americans, but mostly that's the collective West. So this I would say that over the past several years, this gradually has been building up in power. I mean, this development generally. And I would say that the Karabakh conflict showed that how Russian and Turkish alternatives worked in terms of peace building, and how those powers and some other powers will try to do the same in Afghanistan, in Central Asia, in the Middle East. I would say that the attempt was made, of course, at least in terms of statements regarding the long-lasting conflict in between Hamas and Israel. But I mean, the ultimate success of those initiatives again will depend on the push, the resistance from the West. I mean, the timing is interesting here because we've got in the West reinvigorated, I would say, US leadership. But what troubles me is that you might have this resurgence in the US leadership, but this leadership still will be mainly preoccupied with other Eurasian regions, and I think that's the Indo-Pacific region. So overall, what the US will try to do is just to cement its already held positions in Europe and the Middle East, but it will not necessarily try to confront Russians, Iranians, and other powers, because simply the US might not have enough energy and resources to deal with every Eurasian power at the same time. So I believe that if you look over the past year, you see several initiatives made by the Turks, Iranians, Russians, even Chinese, on at least on rhetorical level. How many initiatives were proposed for the Middle East and specifically for the South Caucasus. And I think that this process will continue. You simply cannot really get rid of those powers' influence in the region. Of course, slightly different and rather important development was the swap return of prisoners of war from Azerbaijan to Armenia, and by that I mean the role of US and Georgian leadership. So in a way, US can at times influence even these remote conflicts. But unfortunately, what I see is that we might have further withdrawal, or I would say empowerment of Eurasian powers to exclude the collective West, whether it's in the South Caucasus or in the Middle East.
Thank you, Emil. Ambassador, let me phrase the following question to you. Dr. Abdeliani was mentioning the new U.S. leadership, and probably next attempt from my side to frame the quite a complex issue. But again, I mean, we're here intelligent people, so we've got used to complex questions. What we saw, at least during the recent conflicts, and I mentioned when I introduced the distinguished panel that was the first test for Abraham's Accords. And what I saw was a really distinct attitude by Saudi Arabians, by United Arab Emirates. Was it just because of following the letter of the Abraham's Accords, or something else? Because this was the first case, correct me if wrong, and don't hesitate to correct me if wrong, as brutally as you can. That was the first instance, when they refrained from showing the solidarity with Palestinians, which they've been doing for many, many years. So was it because the letter of the law of the Accords, or something else? And that's something else which I'm sort of hinting, probably for the United States disentangling from the region and leaving the region under the ownership of the regional states who have to deal with each other. So, or there could be some other reasons also, which we're not familiar. So, Ambassador, please give us your insight.
Thank you. This is a very interesting question, of course, and I must say that commentators, analysts, and politicians in Israel have been debating this since the war. Um, we have to take a wider perspective, I think, and remind ourselves that the first peace treaty Israel signed with an Arab country came in 1979 with Egypt. We're talking about 42 years ago. So Egypt, the biggest, the strongest, the most powerful Arab nation, signed a peace treaty with Israel in 1979, long before we even had a peace process with the Palestinians, which started in 1993. Since then, we also signed a peace treaty with Jordan in 1995, and we've had increasingly open relationships, sometimes not official or diplomatic, but commercial, certainly commercial relationships with some Arab countries, for example, Oman. And recently, in the past year, as you mentioned, the Abraham Accords signified a dramatic step forward. Israel signed a peace treaty with 4 Arab nations, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, and we have already opened 2 embassies. We're about to open 2 more in the near future. So the trend has been set by Egypt already 4 decades ago, that yes, public opinion all over the Arab world is hugely sympathetic towards the Palestinians, but the leadership sometimes pays lip service to the Palestinian cause, but continues managing the national affairs according to the national interest. And if Egypt or Jordan or Morocco or United Arab Emirates conclude that a peace with Israel served the national interest more than continue the state of Cold War with Israel in sympathy with the Palestinians, then they would have no hesitation in doing so. Now, to this, we have to add 2 more factors. First of all, Iran. In the past decade, at least, I mean, it started right after the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, especially in the past decade, once it became evident that Iran was well on its way towards developing a nuclear weapon, and Iran has been upgrading and escalating its support of Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, some of the Shia militias in Iraq and elsewhere, then the Middle East has rearranged itself or realigned itself according to an axis of basically Sunni moderate countries and Israel, as opposed to Iran and its proxies. Unfortunately, it's not a neat division, because one of the most important allies that Iran has had in recent years is not at all a Shia country, and that's Turkey. Turkey has been cooperating increasingly with Iran in recent years. But Saudi Arabia has been veering towards the other side because it considers Iran to be its real regional enemy, not Israel, but Iran. So when you consider that Iran has been the major supplier of Hamas, of arms, money, training, then of course, with Saudi Arabia and other moderate Sunni countries in the region are looking at the map, they're going to conclude that Hamas is not on their side, or they're not on the side of Hamas. The final element that we have to remind ourselves of is the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, Hamas, as I said all along, is not a political movement. The PLO, even during the height of Palestinian terrorism in the 60s and 70s, the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and Fatah, led by Yasser Arafat, they were terrorist organizations with political purposes. Palestinian statehood, national determination for the Palestinians. Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood movement that was created in Egypt, not in Palestine, in Egypt in the 1920s, a century ago. We're talking about almost 3 decades before the state of Israel was established. So Hamas, well, even though Hamas itself was created only in the 1980s, it's an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood movement that was created in the 1920s. The Muslim Brotherhood movement is considered the biggest internal threat to most of the Muslim Sunni governments in the Middle East. The Egyptian government, the Jordanian government, even the Saudi government have been trying to isolate and marginalize and sometimes outlaw and ban outright Muslim Brotherhood in their own respective jurisdictions and constituencies. So once again, for them, it proves exactly the point that I was making all along. This is not a war between Israel and Palestine. This was a war between Israel and Hamas, and all the moderate Arab governments in the region considered it as such. And since Hamas is supported by Iran and is an offshoot of Muslim Brotherhood, it's clear that they were not going to jeopardize their peace with Israel over that.
Thank you, Ambassador. One question to you, Emil, and if you could respond in 4 or 5 minutes, so I could ask last question to the ambassador. As I know, you follow Iranian media, yeah. At least you have an access. So, would you please elucidate me? What are the prospects, if any? Since we're talking about Israel and Iran's nuclear, the program is crucial. It's vital for foreign security. So, what are the prospects for restoring the nuclear pact with Iran? And also in relation to Iran, that's why I also asked you about your insight with sort of about your knowledge from the first sources of Iranian media. As we read recently, Russia was supposed or is supposed to supply Iran with an advanced satellite system that will boost Tehran's ability to surveil military targets. Although later Russians denied it. So is it true or is it non-true? So I mean, actually, both questions relate to Iran, although in another sequence they relate to Iran's advanced military capabilities and would definitely eventually come to Israel.
Thank you, Victor. Yes, I think that what we've got from the Iranian media is that you've got numerous outlets which basically have their own line of thinking regarding more positivity in relation to the nuclear accord, restoration of nuclear accord, I would say. Some outlets which are very negative because they simply do not trust the Western American leadership at all. And so you've got this nearly on a daily basis, whereas thinking within the Iranian leadership, military, security, presidency, those sources which are related to the Ayatollah and so on. And you see juggling of basically of various strengths of opinions, of thinking. I would not say that we've got simply one strength of thinking which is dominating right now, but in a way, the Iranians could be more positive to the restoration of the nuclear accord because it simply will alleviate their economic problems. But again, I do not really see for the moment a shift in the media itself. Saying that definitely there are upcoming sort of changes or sort of potential changes regarding the nuclear accord. Regarding the Russian issue, yes, that's what usually happens in Russo-Iranian relations. Basically, that the Russians see huge potential in Iran in terms of economic and military cooperation, but those sanctions, US sanctions, hinder Russian initiatives, Russian penetration of Iran. And of course, for the Russians, Iran sort of is a card by which they at times influence the West. So the West might simply be pushing Russians not to sell, just to stop, not to sell arms, or just to stop sort of cooperating with Iran on various issues. But and at times Russians are backing off. But I would say that over the past year, there have been some progress still between Russian and Iranian sort of militaries and more, I would say, intelligence services. Basically, that's the sharing of critical information between the two sides, and various agreements were signed regarding this sort of cooperation, I would say.
Mhm. Thank you, Dr. Abdelianis. Thank you so much indeed. And Your Excellency, last question in course of this webinar to you, please, and I'll try to phrase this as diplomatically as possible. But still, my mind is always I'm always trying to dig, into multifaceted issues and trying to understand how in the modern world the right relationships could be structured between the big power and the relatively small power. And I think that the case of Israel, when we speak about Israel and the United States, is really very important for us. With all the similarities, which you rightly pointed out when giving your brilliant lecture at GeoCase, but still, the question is that, well, the Prime Minister Bennett, who is saying virtually that Palestinian state means no Israel state. That's the equation. Same time, as I see it, in my understanding, that the Democratic Party, which is in the White House, it shows some discrepancies towards Palestinian one-state solution or this so-called two-state solution. So this is on the one side of the pendulum. On the next side of the pendulum, when we speak about Israel versus United States of America, we have a legacy of Benjamin Netanyahu, who was strongly tied up with the Republican Party of the United States. And I even came across the statement which your current boss, Mr. Yair Lapid, stated. He virtually said that the outgoing government took a terrible game, reckless and dangerous, to focus exclusively on the Republican Party and abandon Israel's bipartisan standing. So, as I did some prep work, for this webinar, I came across various sources that one of the priorities of this government would be to mend the ties with the White House, and also very importantly, to mend the ties with the Jewish diaspora in the United States. So, that dilemma which the new government will be facing, would you please provide with your knowledgeable comment? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, you're absolutely right, as always, Victor, with your analysis. It's not a secret that in recent years, the Democratic Party in America has been less homogeneous than it used to be. And we're seeing some very, call them far left or progressive or radical, depending on one's point of view, becoming more and more dominant. This has a lot to do with the demographic trends in America, the fact that the Latinos, the African Americans are becoming more and more prominent. So it's a demographic shift. It doesn't come as a surprise, and naturally, these groups of population want to make their voices heard. Now, it's not the first time that we've had so-called, how shall I put it, hiccups in our relationship with the United States of America. The relationship during the time of Ronald Reagan, later on, the latter of Reagan and George Bush Sr., we've seen several major crises. For example, in the early 90s, George Bush Sr. refused to renew the American state guarantees to international. And that was one of the deepest bilateral crises we've ever.
Emil Lockhart. Hello.
Yes.
Yes. We had some technical.
Okay.
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah. So we've had some glitches, some hiccups in our relationship, bilateral relations with America for decades. But the fact of the matter is that Israel has enjoyed a steadfast, continuous support of American administrations, both Democratic and Republican, for over half a century. And that hasn't changed. Now, to draw an analogy to Israel's relations with Georgia, both sides always celebrate and flag up our 26 centuries of friendship and coexistence, which is absolutely true and for which we are hugely grateful. However, when it comes to bilateral relations or a governmental level, diplomatic relations, friendship has very little to do with it. Friendship is valid amongst individuals. However, on a state level, countries behave themselves according to their national interests. So America would not have supported Israel continuously for over half a century had it not been for the fact that there is a very, very strong commonality of interests. Those interests sometimes change over time. During the Cold War, Israel was a testing ground for American military technology. Israel was the advanced vanguard bastion of the West in a Middle East that was largely dominated by the Soviets. The Cold War is over, so later on it was the energy policy. Then it was counterterrorism during the First and Second Gulf War. But the fact of the matter is that even if governments change, and even if there's a temporary lack of personal chemistry between the two leaderships, the commonality of interest is there and it's durable and it's not likely to change. Therefore, we were gratified to see that President Biden called our new Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, literally within hours of his swearing in, which was a public and strong expression of support. And I have no doubt that it will continue like that for years to come.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. I always truly enjoy hearing your various statements and observations. And the last one which you made was really brilliant and much for the attention of the Georgians when you distinguished friendship, partnership, and national interest. And those are, I'm not saying, completely isolated from each other, but have their own different meaning. And that's something which this country, Georgia, should realize, appreciate, and understand, those differences to large extent. So thank you so much indeed. We ran out of time, and of course, I would love to speak with you for hours and hours, but the discipline is discipline. So may I thank you, a good friend of this time we speak about individuals, so I could say a good friend of this country, His Excellency, Ambassador of Israel to Georgia, Mr. Rangidor, my good friend from Georgia, Dr. Emil Avdaliani. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for your thoughts. I may peace, harmony, and good health be with you and your beloved ones. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.